Welcome back to the Cineflux. I am genuinely glad you are here tonight. There are certain films that do not simply exist in your memory, they live there. They have a smell, a texture, a specific quality of light. And The Mummy, the 1999 version, the one with sand swirling across a desert harem and a grin that should not belong in a horror film, but somehow fits perfectly. That film is one of those. It moved into some corner of my imagination a long time ago, and it never quite left. So tonight we are going there together, not just to revisit it, but to truly sit with it, to ask what it actually is, what it was trying to do, and whether it did it well enough to deserve the warmth we still carry for it. Pull up somewhere comfortable. Let this one breathe. This is the Cineflux. To understand what the mummy meant when it arrived, you have to travel back to the cultural atmosphere of the late 1990s. And I mean really travel back, not just to the year 1999, but to the specific mode of popular cinema at that moment. Because that mode was restless in the most interesting way. Hollywood had just come through a decade of excess, of new-lit action films and high-concept blockbusters that had slowly begun to feel hollow from the inside. Audiences were sophisticated now. They had seen Jurassic Park and understood what spectacle could be. They had seen Schindler's List and understood what cinema could carry. And in the years between those two pours, a specific kind of film had almost vanished from the landscape. The grand, sweeping, unashamedly romantic adventure film. The kind of film that Indiana Jones had embodied in the 1980s. That sense of a world still large enough to hide wonders, of history as a living, breathing, dangerous thing that could reach forward and grab you by the throat. Think about what the cinema landscape looked like in 1998 and 1999. Saving Private Ryan had reset the language of war cinema into something unbearably visceral. The Matrix was weeks away from permanently altering how young audiences imagined action. Titanic had just reminded the entire industry that emotion was the engine beneath spectacle, not its competitor. And in the middle of this extraordinary convergence of serious films and paradigm shifting ones, Universal Pictures was attempting something that looked, on paper, almost quaint. They were making a mummy movie, a monster movie set in the sands of ancient Egypt, built on the bones of their 1932 Universal classic. In an era of self-conscious, irony-drenched entertainment, an era that had largely decided that sincerity was unsophisticated, they were betting on sincerity. That bet is everything. That is the lens through which The Mummy has to be understood. Universal's classic monster franchise had been largely dormant since the 1950s. The studio had flirted with rebels before. There had been various projects, various attempts to resurrect the old icons in new forms. None of them had quite landed. And so when producer James Jacks and Sean Daniel approached writer and director Stephen Sommers with a concept, the initial idea was actually something closer to a dark horror film, reportedly more in the spirit of the 1932 Boris Karloff original, which itself was a genuinely eerie atmospheric piece of cinema. What it eventually became was something considerably different, and whether transformation was an act of creative courage or creative compromise is one of the most interesting questions you can ask about this film, because The Mummy, as released in the summer of 1999, is not a horror film. It is an adventure film wearing a monster movie's clothing. It is Indiana Jones by way of a creature feature, with a romantic comedy beating quietly inside its chest. That shifting conception, that reaching away from darkness towards something more broadly appealing, shaped every single choice the film makes from its opening frame to its last. And critically, it shaped how it was received, because the critical community of 1999 was not particularly kind to it. Reviews were mixed at best. Some dismissed it as loud, empty entertainment. Some found its cheerful shamelessness to be the whole point. The audience was a different story entirely. The Mummy opened in May of 1999 and earned approximately $43 million in its opening weekend in North America alone. By the time it finished its theatrical run, it had crossed $400 million worldwide against a production budget that was reportedly around $80 million. That is not just a hit, that is a cultural event. That is a film that a great many people decided independently that they needed to see and then needed to see again. and yet it received no major awards consideration, no Academy recognition, no Golden Globe conversation. It existed in that particular space that the critical establishment has always found uncomfortable, the space where popular and beloved occupy the same territory without being sophisticated or important enough to celebrate formally. What is interesting looking back from where we stand now is that the mummy's cultural life did not end with its theatrical run. It found its second home on cable television and home video in a way that very few films of its era managed quite so completely. For an entire generation, particularly those who were children or young teenagers in the late 1990s and early 2000s, The Mummy was simply always on. Saturday afternoon, Sunday evening, every day, school, how hard that. It one of those films that seem to inhabit television itself, to belong to the small screen as much as the large one. And through that constant re exposure, it did something that critical consensus had not done for it. It built a legacy. There is a term people use now, comfort film. A film you return to not because you expect to be challenged or transformed, but because its specific atmosphere feels like a room you have always known. The Mummy became, for a very large number of people, exactly that kind of film. It became associated with a specific quality of warm, uncomplicated pleasure, adventure without consequence, romance without complication, horror defined into something you could enjoy with a bowl of popcorn in the safety of your living room. And if that sounds like mild praise dressed up as a fiction, that is actually one of the central tensions of this essay. Because I think The Mummy is, in certain ways, a more interesting film than that framing gives it credit for, and in other ways, it is precisely the slightly hollow but enormously enjoyable confection that its critics always claimed it was. When we talk about streaming discovery and second wave cultural relevance, The Mummy sits in a fascinating position. Unlike many films of its era that have been quietly forgotten, it has maintained genuine visibility. It arrives on streaming platforms and it trends. It attracts new viewers who discovered it as children and return to it as adults searching for the texture of a specific memory. It attracts genuinely new audiences as well. Young people who approach it without nostalgia and who often find, somewhat to their surprise, that something in it still works, that something still hums. The question of what that something that is where this essay really lives. Does the mummy feel timeless or perfectly of its time? Honestly, I think it feels like both simultaneously. The CGI in certain moments has aged with the unmistakable quality of all late 1990s digital effects, that slightly smooth, hyper-rare quality that speaks very clearly of the specific capabilities and limitations of that technological moment. The adventure structure, the gender dynamics, the particular brand of wisecracking American heroism, all of these carry the fingerprints of their era. But underneath those surface elements, something more durable exists. A sense of genuine play, a commitment to emotional clarity, a willingness to be exactly what it says it is without apologizing for any of it. And that quality is genuinely rare in any era. So that is the world the mummy was born into. A late 1990s cinema landscape hungry for spectacle but slightly tired of emptiness. A studio taking a calculated but creatively sincere gamble on adventure as an emotional mode. An audience ready to give something warm and energetic exactly the response it needed. And a critical establishment that looked at it, shrugged, and moved on, leaving the film to build its own legend quietly, in living rooms and on weekend afternoons, one generation at a time. Now, let us talk about the film itself. The Mummy was directed by Stephen Sommers and released by Universal Pictures on May 7, 1999. It stars Brendan Fraser as Rick Connell, Rachel Weisz as Evelyn, Evie Kanahan, John Hannah as her brother Jonathan, and Arnold Vosloo as Imhotep, the resurrected Egyptian high priest whose awakening sets everything in motion. The supporting cast includes Kevin J. O'Connor as Benny, Odette Fair as Ardette Bay, and Patricia Velasquez as Anck-su-namun. The score was composed by Jerry Goldsmith and the film was produced with a combination of location photography in Morocco and extensive studio work. At its heart, this is a film about what adventure stories are actually about, which is not treasure or danger or even survival, but the question of who you are when the world stops being ordinary. That is the real engine beneath every great adventure narrative. The external journey is always a mirror for the internal one, and the mummy, for all its sand and spectacle and scarabs, understands this in its bones even when it occasionally forgets to honor it fully. The world this film inhabits is Egypt, 1923, and then Egypt again, 1926, a world still caught in the romanticized mythology of the Orient that Western adventure fiction had constructed for itself across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is a world of explorers and antiquarians, of colonial era adventure with all the complicated politics that implies, of ancient curses and forbidden knowledge, and the very human impulse to reach toward things we were perhaps never meant to touch. The film does not interrogate that colonial framework particularly deeply, and that is one of its genuine limitations, which we will come to. But within the frame it builds, it creates a world that feels genuinely alive, hot, dusty, dangerous in a way that thrills rather than truly frightens. Stephen Sommers is a director whose work has always sat at the popular, energetic end of the storytelling spectrum. His instinct is for pace, for momentum, for the pleasure of pure forward motion. He is not a filmmaker who lingers in ambiguity or builds emotional layers through silence and stillness. What he does extraordinarily well is orchestrate set pieces, tonal shifts, the rhythm of comedy landing against genuine tension. And in The Mummy, that particular skill finds perhaps its most effective expression. There are sequences in this film, and we will spend real time with them, where the orchestration of action, comedy, and genuine dread is handled with a control that most blockbuster directors never quite achieve. The cast he assembled is, in retrospect, one of the most perfectly calibrated ensembles of its era. Brendan Fraser brings a quality to Rick O'Connell that is genuinely hard to replicate, a kind of physical comedy grounded in real commitment, a heroism that never takes itself entirely seriously, and underneath both of those things, an emotional openness that makes you care about him even when the film around him is operating at full volume. Rachel Weisz brings something different. She brings the sense of a real person caught inside a genre film, someone with genuine interior life who happens to also be charming and funny and entirely convincing in every moment. The chemistry between them is not incidental to the film's success. It is the film's success. Without it, everything else is just noise. This is a film that asks whether you would like to be swept away for 2 hours. It does not pretend to be profound. It does not claim to be art in the way a Bergman film or a Tarkovsky film claims to be art. But what the best adventure cinema has always understood, what Raiders of the Lost Ark understood, what The Princess Bride understood, what the very best of this genre always gets right, is that sincerity is its own form of artistry. Caring fully about what you are making, even when what you are making is a mummy movie, produces something that a technically superior but emotionally hollow film can never quite replicate. Should you watch The Mummy? If you have not yet, yes. Not because it will change your understanding of cinema, not because it will linger in your mind as a philosophical challenge, but because it offers something genuinely valuable and genuinely rare, the experience of pure, warm, enthusiastic adventure storytelling executed with considerable skill and real affection. And because buried inside it, there is more going on than it usually gets credit for, more character, more heart, more genuine craft than the phrase comfort film would suggest. Go in without expectation, let it do what it is trying to do, and then come back here and we will figure out together exactly how well it did it. There is a particular kind of memory that does not live in the mind so much as in the body. You do not remember it so much as you feel it return. A specific quality of anticipation, a particular tension in the chest, the way the air in a room seemed to change when something on a screen grabbed you before you even understood what it was doing. My first real encounter with the mummy was one of those bodily memories. I was young enough that the world of the film felt genuinely possible. Ancient Egypt was not a historical abstraction, but a living geography. Curses were not metaphors but real threats, and the idea that somewhere beneath the sand a man had been buried alive for 3,000 years and was now, slowly, furiously, terrifyingly returning, that idea did not need convincing. It simply arrived and took hold. But I want to be precise about something because precision matters here. When I say my first encounter with the mummy, I do not mean the first time I was in the same room as it. I mean the first time I truly sat with it, gave it my full attention. Let it work on me the way films are supposed to work on you, which is quietly, from the inside, building something you will not fully understand until long after the credits have finished rolling. Because there is a difference between watching a film and receiving it, and The Mummy is one of those films that rewards genuine receiving in ways that casual watching never quite reveals. When I first sat with this film properly, I expected a certain thing. I expected the cinematic equivalent of a theme park ride, loud, fast, aggressively entertaining, and emotionally about as deep as a swimming pool. I expected Brendan Fraser to be broadly funny in the way that action heroes of that era were broadly funny, all raised eyebrows and one-liners, the comedic relief that also happened to be the protagonist. I expected Rachel Weisz to be the love interest in the way that 1990s blockbusters understood love interest, present, competent enough to be defensible, but ultimately secondary to the spectacle. I expected Arnold Vosloo to be a villain in the broad theatrical tradition of genre villains, scary when the script needed him to be, defeatable when it needed him to be that instead. What I found was something considerably more complicated, not more profound, not more sophisticated in the way that prestige cinema is sophisticated, but more alive than I had anticipated, more emotionally specific, more invested in its own characters than the genre typically demands or even rewards. And the opening sequence was the first indication that something slightly more interesting was happening beneath the surface noise. The film opens in ancient Egypt, 290 BC, and from the very first frame, there is something happening tonally that I think is easy to miss if you are watching rather than receiving. The prologue is not simply backstory, it is not functional world building inserted to provide context for the monster we will eventually face. It is a tragedy, a genuine, quietly heartbreaking tragedy about forbidden love and catastrophic loyalty, about a man who chose a woman over everything, including his own survival, including his soul, including the entire principle of order that his position in the world demanded he uphold. Imhotep, the high priest of Osiris, was not simply a villain who made an evil choice. He was a man who made an understandable choice in the worst possible circumstances and paid for it across 3,000 years of darkness. Think about what that means for the entire shape of the film. The Mummy asks us in its very first minutes to understand the monster before we fear it, to feel the specific gravity of what he lost before we see what his return costs the living. That is not a choice that a purely entertainment focused blockbuster makes by accident. That is a storytelling instinct, an awareness that threat without dimension is just noise, and that the most powerful kind of fear is the kind that carries grief inside it. The prologue establishes that Imhotep's love for Anck-su-namun was absolute. She was the Pharaoh's mistress, untouchable by any other man, her body an object of possession rather than a person with autonomous desire, and yet Imhotep loved her, and she returned that love. And when the Pharaoh discovered them, Anck-su-namun made a choice as absolute as Imhotep's love. She chose death over captivity, over the shame of what had been discovered, over the life that would have been left to her after that moment. She asked Imhotep to allow her to die. And he did. He let her go, and this is the pivot point of the entire mythology. He could not accept that choice. He went after her. He stole her soul back from the afterlife in an act that the Egyptian world understood as the deepest possible sacrilege. He tried to make love stronger than death, and for that he was condemned to something far worse than death. He was buried alive, sealed beneath the sand with the Homdai, the darkest of all ancient curses, intended to keep him imprisoned for eternity. By the time the title card appeared and the film leaped forward 3,000 years to 1923, I was already inside something, already invested in a story that had not yet introduced its protagonists, already holding the emotional weight of a relationship that would spend most of the film trying to destroy everything in its path. That is remarkable craft. That is an opening that does precisely what a great opening is supposed to do. It creates emotional stakes that outlast the scene that establishes them. The atmosphere the film creates in those early minutes is worth dwelling on at some length because it is one of the things The Mummy does better than almost anything I can think of in the genre. The visual language of ancient Egypt as the film constructs. It is not the archaeological Egypt of museum placards and documentary photography. It is the Egypt of imagination, golden, fast, haunted, beautiful in a way that feels simultaneously inviting and deeply wrong, like a beautiful room where something terrible once happened, and the air still knows it. The cinematography by Adrian Biddle gives the ancient sequences a warmth that should feel safe and instead feels ominous. The color is honeyed and close, and the scale of the architecture dwarfs the human figures within it in a way that makes you feel, viscerally, how small individual lives are against the backdrop of the civilizations they inhabit. And then the film jolts forward. The prologue ends and the present 1923 Thai begins. And here is where the tonal shift happens that defines everything the mummy is trying to do. Because 1923 Hamunaptra is not ancient Egypt. It is the Western adventure fiction version of ancient Egypt, sun-baked and comic and dangerous and romantic, populated by French foreign legionnaires and rival treasure hunters and men with maps and enormous confidence and very little wisdom. The shift in tone is abrupt and absolutely intentional. The film moves from tragedy to comedy in the space of a single cut. And your first instinct might be to resist it, to feel the whiplash as a flaw, as tonal inconsistency, as a failure of commitment. I want to argue that it is actually the film's central structural intelligence. That whiplash is deliberate. The comedy of 1923, the broad physicality, the one-liners, the general cheerfulness of the adventure framework exists in active, constant, conscious contrast to the tragedy of 1290 BC. The lightness of the present is always haunted by the weight of the past. Every moment of humor in the film's contemporary storyline carries within it the awareness of what the past cost, what the present is about to unleash, what the gap between ancient grief and modern flippancy actually means. The film never articulates this contrast directly. It does not need to. It simply holds them together and trusts you to feel the relationship between them. The opening of the contemporary storyline introduces us to Rick O'Connell in a manner that is, frankly, one of the better character introductions of its era. We meet him mid-battle. He is part of a Legion regiment being slaughtered by a vastly superior force near the ruins of Hamunaptra, and rather than establishing him as infallibly competent or conventionally heroic, the film immediately gives us something more interesting, a man who is clearly very good at survival, but who seems to treat his own continued existence as a somewhat amusing surprise. He fights with genuine skill and genuine joy, and when his regiment collapses around him and he finds himself alone against an overwhelming enemy, his response is not despair or defiance, but something that reads almost like amused acceptance. He has looked at impossible odds before. He recognizes them. He is not sure they are going to end in this time either. That quality, that almost philosophical relationship with one's own luck, is what Brendan Fraser understood about this character in a way that I do not think any other actor of that era would have understood it in quite the same way. Rico Cornon is not a hero who has decided to be heroic. He is a survivor who has discovered that survival, when practiced long enough and with enough commitment, starts to resemble heroism from the outside. There is a lightness to him that is not the lightness of someone who does not care. It is the likeness of someone who has decided that caring, really caring, weighing and measuring and calculating the odds is a kind of weight he cannot afford to carry and still move fast enough to stay alive. Fraser plays this with an ease that looks effortless and is almost certainly not. The film's parallel opening for Evelyn is equally good and for entirely different reasons. She is introduced in the Cairo Museum of Antiquities, climbing a very tall ladder among shelves of artifacts, rearranging things by a system that makes perfect sense to her and apparently to no one else. She is brilliant and absent minded and completely confident in her own framework of understanding, while being wonderfully, endearingly incompetent in the practical world that surrounds that framework. She knocks over one shelf and then another in a sequence that is pure physical comedy. The kind of comedy that works not because it is mean or absurdist, but because it is deeply character specific. This is not a generic clumsy person knocking over generic shelves. This is a woman whose entire relationship with the physical world is mediated through the life of the mind, and a gap between how capable she is intellectually and how capable she is practically is not a flaw. It is a portrait. Rachel Weisz was, by her own account in interviews, not the first choice for this role. The casting process was reportedly extensive and involved numerous actresses. What Weisz brought that the role absolutely required was a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe precisely, a sense of genuine intelligence that could carry comedy without diminishing itself, that could be funny without being foolish, that could be charmed by a man who is clearly her inferior in education and culture, while making it entirely clear that she is doing the charming from a position of strength rather than need. She is not swept off her feet by Rigonen. She chooses him quietly and with full awareness from the very first moment their story intersects. And that is a fundamentally different dynamic from what the genre usually offers, even when it believes it is offering something more progressive. Their first meeting, in a prison cell in Cairo, where Rick is awaiting execution for various crimes against public order that the film wisely never specifies fully, is one of those scenes that the film gets exactly right. The power dynamic should favor him. He has information she needs. She is at a disadvantage in the negotiation. But Weisz plays Evie as someone who has simply never accepted that power dynamics of that kind are real or meaningful, and the result is a scene where two people who are clearly going to fall in love are operating on completely different frequencies and somehow producing perfect harmony between them. She wants his map. He wants his life. The bargain that results from those two needs is so obviously correct, and so obviously the beginning of something much larger than either of them intends that it generates the specific kind of dramatic irony that romantic adventure relies on, the audience knowing something about these characters before the characters know it about themselves. Jonathan Carnahan, Evie's brother, played with extraordinary committed buffoonery by John Hannah, is a character who could very easily be pure comic relief and nothing more. The script, to its credit, does slightly more than that, though not always as much as it could. Jonathan exists primarily to diffuse tension with inappropriate enthusiasm and to provide the plot's inciting mechanism. He is the one who found Rick's map, the one who stole it from someone who probably should not have owned it, the one whose cheerful amorality keeps moving everyone forward when wisdom would suggest stopping. But Hannah plays him with such specific, lived-in quality that Jonathan feels like a genuine person rather than a narrative function. He is not simply cowardly and greedy, though he is certainly both of those things. He is also warm, loyal in his sideways fashion, and possessed of a self-awareness about his own inadequacy that he wears so lightly that it nearly reads as confidence. Nearly. The journey to Hamunaptra, by boat down the Nile and then into the desert, is where the film shifts into its full adventure register. And it is here that the pacing truly establishes itself as one of the film's most distinctive qualities. Stephen Sommers moves through these early sequences with a pace that is rapid but never thoughtless. Each scene earns its exit before taking it. Each new complication, the rival group of American treasure hunters, the mysterious Magi warriors, the growing sense that something ancient and patient is watching the expedition's progress, arrives at precisely the right interval to prevent momentum from settling into routine. The film breathes in sequences rather than individual scenes, and the rhythm of tension and release, action and character, comedy and dread is orchestrated with a confidence that is easy to take for granted because it works so smoothly. The boat sequence deserves particular attention because it does something the film does not always get enough credit for. It uses its supporting characters as genuine narrative instruments rather than background texture. The American treasure hunters, led by the wonderfully oily Henderson, Daniels, and Burns, are introduced as antagonists within the adventure framework, rivals for the same prize, operating by the same rough moral code as Rick and Company, but without the romantic attachment that will eventually matter. Their Egyptologist guide, Dr. Alan Chamberlain, provides the expert context that neither Evie nor the Carnahan brothers can provide alone. And Benny, Rick's former Legion comrade, now operating entirely in his own interest, is one of those supporting characters who illuminates the protagonist by contrast. Rick survived the same circumstances that made Benny into something venal and small. The film does not labor this point. It simply places them in the same frame occasionally and lets the contrast do its work. The arrival at Hamunaptra is one of the film's genuinely beautiful moments, a sequence where the spectacle and the emotion briefly align perfectly. The ancient city emerging from the desert mist, its impossible architecture, half buried and half standing, speaks to something very old in the human imagination. The idea of a lost world, the idea that the past does not disappear but simply hides, biding its time beneath the surface of the present. Hamunaptra is not just a location in the mummy. It is a symbol of everything the film is ultimately about: the past's refusal to stay buried, the danger of reaching for things you are not meant to find, the terrible beauty of things that should not exist anymore but do. When the ruins emerge from the sand in the early morning light, the camera holds on the faces of the characters, and you can see on each of them a different version of the same feeling: wonder, fear, the particular combination of both that only genuine discovery produces. And it is here, inside Hamunaptra, in the excavations beneath the ruined city, that the film's central mistake is made. Not Rick's mistake, not Jonathan's. Evelyn's. And this is the part of the story that I find most interesting from a character perspective, because it is the moment where the film's most intelligent character makes the least intelligent choice, and the choice is absolutely believable because it comes from exactly the place that her intelligence lives. Evie finds the Book of the Dead, the ancient text, wrapped in sacred cloth, sealed with the sacred key she has been carrying without understanding what it was, and she opens it. She reads from it. She is an Egyptologist, a linguist, a woman who has spent her entire life in love with the ancient world and trained to understand it, and she is holding the most extraordinary archaeological discovery of the modern era, and of course she reads it. Of course she does. That is who she is. Her intelligence, her curiosity, her absolute competence in the primacy of knowledge over superstition. These are the qualities that make her extraordinary, and they are precisely the qualities that make this particular mistake inevitable. She does not open the book despite being brilliant. She opens the book because she is brilliant, and because brilliance, untempered by the kind of knowledge that experience provides, can lead you directly into the thing you are trying to understand. That moment, Evie leaning over the ancient text in the flickering torchlight, her face full of the pure joy of discovery, reading words that have not been spoken aloud in 3,000 years, is the film's emotional pivot. Everything before it is set up, everything after it is consequence. And that consequence arrives immediately, with a rumbling that the earth makes when something very old is shifting beneath it, when something that has been waiting with infinite patience has finally received the signal it was promised. Imhotep's awakening is handled with considerable intelligence by Summers and his effects team, and here is where the film's horror instincts briefly reassert themselves before being submerged again beneath the adventure surface. The early stages of the resurrection are genuinely uncomfortable. There is something about the imagery of incompleteness, of a body assembling itself from dust and desire and 3,000 years of accumulated rage, that touches something primal in the viewer. Vosloo in these early sequences is not performing so much as embodying. He moves with a quality that is genuinely unsettling, that combination of human memory and inhuman patience that the concept of the mummy has always carried at its most effective. But here is where the mummy makes a choice that its critics have always seized on, and which I think deserves honest engagement. As Imhotep grows stronger, As he feeds and reconstitutes himself and begins to move through the world of the living with increasing purpose, the film becomes gradually less interested in making you afraid of him and increasingly interested in making you understand him. The horror registers to give way to the adventure register almost as soon as it has established itself. The genuine dread of the early resurrection sequences is progressively softened as the ensemble comedy reasserts itself, as Rick and Evie and Jonathan find themselves managing this extraordinary crisis with the particular mixture of competence and absurdity that the film has established as its tonal signature. For some viewers, that softening is a betrayal of what the film could have been. For some critics, it was evidence of a fundamental creative timidity, a refusal to commit to the implications of the story, a retreat into comfortable entertainment when something genuinely disturbing was within reach. I think that reading is partially right and simultaneously slightly misses the point. The Mummy was never trying to terrify you in the way that great horror cinema terrifies you. It was trying to give you the feeling of being threatened, the pleasure of danger safely contained, while ultimately delivering the emotional satisfactions of adventure and romance. That is a legitimate artistic ambition, even if it is a more modest one than horror. What the film does with Imhotep as the middle act builds is actually quite carefully considered. He is searching for Anck-su-namun. Everything he does, every terrible act, every plague released, every life consumed to restore his own, is in service of that singular purpose. He is not a villain who desires power or conquest or revenge in the abstract. He desires one specific irreplaceable thing, and the terrible force of his 3,000-year-old grief is the engine of the entire film's catastrophe. When he finds in Evelyn a vessel for the soul of the woman he lost, when his gaze lands on her, and something in him recognizes something in her that we cannot entirely explain rationally but feel as true, the film becomes, briefly, something genuinely complicated. Because in that moment of recognition, the monster becomes a mirror. And the film, which has been content to move quickly and entertainingly through its adventure framework, pauses for just long enough to ask an uncomfortable question. What would you be capable of if you loved someone enough? If the grief of losing them had been compressing itself inside you for 3,000 years, with no outlet, no resolution, no possibility of peace, the film does not dwell on this question. It does not give you extended sequences of Imhotep's interiority or ask you to genuinely sympathize with his methods. But it plants the question and then keeps it alive through Vosloo's performance, through the specific quality of hunger and tenderness that he brings to a role that could very easily be pure villainy, and the question changes the atmosphere of everything around it. The plagues are where the film most explicitly invokes the horror register, and they are handled with a bravado that is more impressive the more carefully you look at it. Summers and his effects team understood something important about what makes supernatural threat visually effective. It is not the scale of the threat, but the wrongness of it. The locust, the boys, the darkness, the river of blood, these are images drawn from one of the most culturally embedded horror mythologies in Western civilization, and their power comes not from anything the film adds to them, but from the accumulated weight of every context in which humanity has previously imagined them. The film does not need to invent the horror of biblical plagues, it simply needs to invoke it. And it does so with enough visual commitment to land the effect even when the digital execution of that era occasionally shows its limitations. But it is in the character dynamics of the middle act that the film earns the most and spends the most. Rick and Evie's relationship is developing across a series of scenes that manage the extremely difficult balance of moving forward emotionally without losing the comedy that has been established and without lurching into the kind of earnest romantic declaration that would feel false to both characters. Their connection built through behavior rather than confession, through the way Rick positions himself without being asked when danger is near, through the way Evie trusts her own instincts about him before she has any rational grounds for that trust. To the specific domestic comedy of two people who are very different and very well matched, discovering simultaneously that those two conditions are not in contradiction. There is a sequence in the middle of the film, the night camp, the fire, the conversation where Evie admits something about her past, and Rick listens with a quality of attention that is not what she expected. That is the single most underrated scene in The Mummy. The film mounts quickly enough that this scene arrives without ceremony and departs before you have quite registered its full weight. But in that brief space, Rachel Weisz and Brendan Fraser are doing something that the film around them does not always ask for. They are building something real, something fragile and specific between two people who are learning that the person they initially dismissed as useful is actually the person they have been waiting for without knowing it. It is a scene that earns the romance that follows, and that the film would be genuinely poorer without, even though it is easy to miss on a first viewing, because it is over before the weight of it has settled. The third approach, the final convergence of all the film's threads, as Imhotep moves toward his resurrection and Rick moves towards stopping it, is handled with the full resources of Sommers' talent for orchestration. The scale expands. The stakes become global in the way that adventure climaxes traditionally demand. The ensemble separates and recombines in patterns that keep the momentum high while ensuring that every major character has a role in the resolution. And through all of it, the film maintains the tonal balance it has been sustaining from the opening. The adventure comedy surface laid over the genuine emotional stakes, the laughs arriving not to undercut the tension, but to provide the breathing space that makes the tension sustainable. And here is where the film shifts completely. Here is the moment that changes the register of everything. The moment where all the comedy and adventure and romantic tension resolve into something that is, briefly, genuinely moving. Where the film stops playing and starts meaning. Where you understand what it has been building toward all along. Not the defeat of the monster, not the recovery of the treasure, not even the love story, but something older and simpler and more durable than any of those things. Something about what it costs to choose the living over the dead, what it means to let go of grief, what genuine love looks like when tested against the kind of force that 3,000 years of supernatural fury can generate. But that belongs to the spoiler section, which will come in its proper time. For now, we stay here, in the middle of the experience, in the gathering darkness of Hamunaptra, with the sand rising and the plagues settling, and two people who are not yet certain what they mean to each other standing in the center of something ancient and terrible and somehow improbably also funny. Because The Mummy at its best is all of those things simultaneously, and holding all of those things together without losing any of them is genuinely hard. It is, in fact, the film's central achievement and the real source of the warmth that audiences have been returning to for over 2 decades. To understand how The Mummy came to exist in the precise form it takes, to understand why it feels the way it feels, why it moves the way it moves, why certain sequences carry an atmospheric weight that pure craft cannot entirely explain, you have to go back further than 1999. You have to go back to the conversations, the drafts, the decisions and revisions and creative disagreements that shaped the film long before a single frame was photographed, because great films, even the ones that wear their pleasures lightly, are almost never accidents. They are the result of accumulated choices, each one building on the last, each one narrowing the space of possibility until what remains is the specific, irreplaceable thing that eventually reaches the screen. The Mummy had a development history that was, by Hollywood standards, unusually complicated for a project that eventually looked so effortless. Universal Pictures had been trying to revive the concept for years before the version we know finally moved into production. Reportedly, at various points in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the project had been envisioned as a straight horror film, something closer in spirit to the 1932 Boris Karloff original, which had approached the mummy mythology with genuine gothic weight and a slow, suffocating atmospheric dread that was very much of its era and very different from what Summers eventually made. There were versions of the script, according to various production accounts, that leaned heavily into the horror register, that imagined Imhotep as a genuinely terrifying presence rather than a tragically romantic one, that placed the story in the contemporary world rather than the adventure era past, that foregrounded the supernatural rather than the human relationships at the center of the catastrophe. What changed everything was reportedly Summers's specific vision for what kind of film this could be. When he came aboard, he brought with him a creative perspective that was rooted not primarily in the universal monster tradition, but in the adventure serials of the 1930s, those rapid, cliffhanger structured entertainments that had given Steven Spielberg the vocabulary for Indiana Jones. Summers reportedly saw The Mummy not as a horror film with adventure elements, but as an adventure film with horror elements, and that inversion, that seemingly minor shift in emphasis, changed everything downstream. It changed the tone, the pacing, the casting, the visual language, the score. It changed fundamentally what kind of experience the film was designed to deliver. That creative decision carried an interesting risk. Universal's brand equity in the monster space was built on horror, on the idea that their classic monsters were genuinely frightening, that they belonged to a tradition of genuine darkness. To soften Imhotep, to place him in a context where the emotional register was adventure romance rather than horror, was to depart from the source material in a way that could have alienated both audiences who wanted genuine scares and audiences who wanted pure adventure. The film would need to hold both registers simultaneously without fully delivering on either. That is a tonal needle that is genuinely hard to tread, and the fact that Summers treaded it as successfully as he did is evidence of a creative intelligence that the critical reception of his work has not always fully acknowledged. The screenplay itself went through numerous drafts, and the final credited version, written by Summers himself, carries within it the evidence of that revision history if you look closely enough. There are moments in the film where the syncs between different creative intentions are faintly visible, where a scene seems to want to be darker than the film around it will allow, or where a character moment seems to want more space than the pace of the adventure framework is willing to give it. These are not exactly flaws so much as they are the traces of a creative negotiation that was still being conducted right up to the point where the camera began rolling. The film we have is the result of that negotiation, and understanding that process helps explain both its particular strengths and its particular limitations. Now, here is the first fact about this production that I find genuinely reshapes how you see a specific part of the film. The role of Rico Cannon was, according to widely reported production accounts, considered for Tom Cruise at one stage in the project's development. Cruise was at the height of his global stardom at this point. Mission Impossible had been a massive success in 1996, and he was one of the few actors in Hollywood who could genuinely open a film internationally on name recognition alone. A version of The Mummy with Cruise in the lead would have been a very different film. It would have been slicker, more polished, more self-consciously star-driven. The heroism would have been more conventional, the comedy would have been more controlled. The entire texture of the central relationship would have shifted because Cruise's screen energy is fundamentally about invulnerability, about the performance of absolute capability, and Rick O'Connor is fundamentally about someone who is capable but not invulnerable, competent but not infallible, heroic but also perpetually surprised to find himself surviving. Every time I watch Brendan Fraser in The Mummy now, every time I see him navigating the space between action and comedy with that particular loose-limbed ease, every time he lands a joke with the timing of someone who is not entirely certain the joke will land and is genuinely delighted when it does, I think about how different, how considerably lesser, the film would have been without him. And the reason that thought has an extra layer of meaning is because of what we know about Fraser's career in the years that followed this film. We know now that he was, by his own eventual account, navigating personal circumstances of considerable darkness during this period of his professional ascent. The ease and warmth and genuine joy that he brought to Rick O'Connor was not a simple performance of uncomplicated happiness. It was something more complex and more earned than that, a man reaching for lightness from a place that was not always light and finding it anyway on camera in a way that the entire film then absorbed and made its own. That knowledge changes nothing about the performance technically. Every choice Fraser makes is still the right choice. Every beat lands precisely as it should. But it adds a dimension to the warmth he brings to the role, a dimension of understanding that this quality of screen presence, this ability to make vulnerability look like confidence and genuine feeling look like effortlessness, is not a gift distributed randomly. It is something achieved, something built, and in Fraser's case, something achieved under conditions that the film never shows and never needed to show. What the film shows is the result, and the result is one of the most genuinely likable lead performances in the adventure genre. The casting of Arnold Vosloo as Imhotep is another decision that deserves considerable examination because it was not at the time an obvious choice. Vosloo was a South African actor with a relatively limited profile in American cinema. His most notable prior role had been in the low-budget superhero film Dark Man 2, which was not exactly the kind of credit that would typically lead to the centerpiece villain of a major studio blockbuster. But Summers reportedly fought for him, and the reasons for that fight are visible in every scene Vosloo occupies. What Vosloo brought to Imhotep was something that the role absolutely required, and that a more famous, more conventionally bankable actor might not have provided: physical presence married to genuine emotional availability. Imhotep is a character who has to function simultaneously as a monster and as a mourner. He has to be capable of generating genuine dread in sequences where he is feeding and growing and assembling his power, and simultaneously capable of generating something that reads as love, or at least as the 3,000-year-old memory of love, which is arguably more frightening than any supernatural power he possesses. Those two qualities are very difficult to hold together in a single performance. Most actors would naturally weight one over the other. Vosloo manages to hold them in genuine tension, and the result is a villain who never entirely loses his humanity, even at his most terrible, which is precisely what the film needs, because the emotional architecture of the ending depends on you feeling, however reluctantly, the full weight of what Imhotep lost and what his obsessive pursuit of its recovery ultimately cost him. There is a specific scene, and I am going to describe it carefully without moving into spoiler territory, where Imhotep is alone with what he believes to be the reincarnated soul of Anck-su-namun. The scene is brief. The film does not linger on it, but Voice in that moment produces something that I have never been able to entirely categorize. It is not tenderness in the way we normally understand tenderness between human beings. It is something older and stranger and more absolute than that, the specific quality of a feeling that has been preserved in amber for 3 millennia, that has not been allowed to develop or change or soften or contextualize itself the way that feelings do when they are allowed to live in the world. It is love that has never had the opportunity to become anything other than love in its most concentrated, most dangerous, most irrevocable form. Vosloo communicates all of that without dialogue, primarily through stillness and the quality of attention in his eyes. It is the single most undervalued moment of acting in the entire film. Rachel Weisz's path to the role of Evelyn is a story that has become somewhat legendary in discussions of the film, and it matters because of what it reveals about how close The Mummy came to being a significantly lesser film. Weisz was not reportedly a frontrunner for the role in the early stages of casting. She had made her name in independent cinema, in Bernardo Bertolucci's Stealing Beauty, and most significantly, in the stage production of Plenty that had established her as a serious actress of considerable range and intelligence. She was not at that point a star in the conventional blockbuster sense. She did not have the Q score that studios typically sought for a lead role in a major summer film. What the casting process apparently revealed was that no actress who read for the role in the conventional star mold quite worked, because Evelyn was not a conventional heroine in the blockbuster mold. She was too specific, too intelligent, too genuinely bookish and authentically nerdy in the way that actual scholars are nerdy, not the Hollywood version of nerdy, which removes the glasses and the awkwardness the moment the story demands it, but the real version, which is characterized by a specific combination of genuine expertise and selective obliviousness to everything outside its domain, outside its domain. To play that version of intelligence convincingly required an actress who actually possessed that quality rather than one who could perform a surface approximation of it, and Weisz possessed it completely and naturally and without apparent effort. What is remarkable about her performance in the film, and what I keep returning to when I think about what The Mummy achieves at the level of character, is the consistency of Evie's interiority. She is never simply reacting to the plot around her. She is always processing it through a specific framework, the framework of someone for whom the ancient world is the most real world that exists, who finds it genuinely difficult to be frightened of things she has spent her professional life studying, whose intellectual delight in discovery keeps reasserting itself even in circumstances that objectively demand fear rather than curiosity. The scene where she is standing in the chamber that contains Imhotep's sarcophagus for the first time, and her face moves through fear into wonder, into the specific professional excitement of an Egyptologist who has found something that should not exist, is a masterclass in character-specific reaction. A lesser performance would have simply been afraid. Wishes is afraid and fascinated and barely able to contain her professional enthusiasm, and the combination of those three things in a single human face is funnier and more human and more true than any of them separately would have been. The second fascinating production fact is about the location work, and it genuinely changes how you experience certain visual qualities of the film. Hamunaptra, the ruined city that serves as the film's primary setting, does not exist, obviously, but the ruins the film uses as the basis for its visual construction of this impossible place are real. The production shot extensively in Morocco, particularly in the areas around Erfoud and the Saharan landscape near the Algerian border, and what those locations provided was not simply visual authenticity but atmospheric authenticity, a specific quality of light and scale and silence that digital construction or studio work could not have replicated at that time. The Moroccan desert at certain times of day has a quality of light that is almost impossibly cinematic, a warmth and directness and clarity that makes everything within it look simultaneously real and mythological, as though the landscape itself exists at the boundary between the ordinary world and some older version of the world that the ordinary one is built on top of. When you watch The Mummy and you feel that Hamunaptra is genuinely ancient, genuinely vast, genuinely a place where something terrible once happened and the land itself remembers it, that feeling comes primarily from those location sequences. The digital effects added the architecture and the scale and the supernatural elements, but the atmosphere was already there, in the sand and the light, waiting to be photographed. Reportedly, the production faced significant logistical challenges in those desert locations. The heat was extreme enough to affect equipment and crew in ways that required constant management. The sand, which looks so elegantly cinematic in the finished film, was a constant presence in every mechanical system, every digital component, every physical space the production occupied. There were sequences that had to be completed in very narrow windows of time because of weather conditions that changed rapidly and with little warning in the desert environment. And there is an argument to be made, a real and interesting one, that those difficulties are legible in the film in the best possible way. That the texture of genuine physical struggle in a genuine physical environment adds something to the adventure sequences that cannot be manufactured in controlled conditions. That sweat and the heat and the relentless presence of actual sand in actual sun produces a quality of visual truth that underpins the fantasy being constructed on top of it. The practical effects working The Mummy deserves extended discussion because it represents a creative moment that existed only very briefly in cinema history, the transitional period when practical effects and digital effects were being used simultaneously, each compensating for the limitations of the other, each contributing something that the other could not. The production reportedly used an enormous amount of practical work for effects that we now tend to think of as digital, the real sand movements, the real architecture architectural elements that were then augmented and extended digitally. The result of that combination is a visual texture that films made entirely digitally, even films made with significantly more sophisticated digital tools than were available in 1999, often fail to replicate because the combination of physical and digital reality produces a visual register that feels tangible in a way that pure digital construction does not quite manage. The third production fact concerns the score, and it is one that I think fundamentally reshapes how you hear the music. Every subsequent time you watch the film, Jerry Goldsmith was brought onto The Mummy later in the production process than is typically ideal, reportedly because the original composer attached to the project departed and Goldsmith was brought in as a replacement with a compressed timeline. What Goldsmith produced in that compressed timeline is one of the finest adventure scores of its era, and the remarkable thing about it is how fully it understands the tonal duality that defines the film. Goldsmith's score for The Mummy operates on two distinct musical levels simultaneously, and the intelligence with which it navigates between them is a significant part of what makes the film's tonal balance work. There is the adventure register, the brassy, percussive forward momentum music that drives the action sequences and provides the emotional infrastructure of the romance. And there is the ancient register, a darker, more ceremonial, more genuinely ominous musical language that is associated with Imhotep and with Hamunaptra and with the 3,000-year-old grief at the center of the story. What is extraordinary is how Goldsmith moves between these two registers, how he allows them to bleed into each other at key moments, how the ancient musical language occasionally surfaces beneath the adventure music like a bass note you feel more than hear, reminding you of the weight that is always pressing upward through the film's lighter surface. The main title sequence, music, the piece that most people associate with the mummy when they are asked to recall its sound, is a perfect example of this dual operation. It is triumphant and kinetic in its surface movement, exactly the kind of music that announces an adventure and makes you lean forward in your seat. But underneath the brass and the percussion there is a modal quality, an almost liturgical architecture that comes directly from the ancient register. It sounds like something genuinely old being channeled through something modern, like a traditional ceremony being conducted in a contemporary building. The walls are new, but the ritual is not. When I watch the sequence where Rick and Evie and Jonathan first ride toward Hamunaptra across the desert, and Goldsmith's main theme rises to meet that image of three small human figures dwarfed by an infinite golden landscape, the music is not simply exciting. It is exciting and elegiac simultaneously. It is saying something about the human scale relative to the ancient world, about the smallness of the adventure we follow against the vast, still enduring tragedy that predates it by 3,000 years. That is not a simple compositional achievement. That is a piece of music doing exactly what the best film scores do, not illustrating what you see, but revealing something about what you feel that the images alone cannot access. The fourth production fact shifts to the relationship between Summers's directorial approach and the specific challenge of staging supernatural spectacle in a way that maintains human scale. The criticism that the digital effects in The Mummy have dated badly is one that I want to engage with honestly, because it is partially correct and simultaneously somewhat misses the point. Yes, the CGI Imhotep in his partially reconstituted state, that specifically late 1990s digital human form, smooth in a way that real human surfaces are not quite smooth, moving with a physicality that is almost straight but not entirely, does not hold up against the digital effects of contemporary blockbusters. The technology has simply advanced too far for that comparison to be kind. But here is what the criticism misses. Summers made a creative decision, reportedly deliberate and defensible, to keep the digitally enhanced Imhotep at a specific visual distance from the audience during the sequences where the artificiality of the effect is most visible. The most intimate, most affecting sequences involving Imhotep are the ones that use Vosloo's physical, practical presence, makeup, prosthetics, the actor's own eyes and hands and stillness, rather than digital construction. The digital Imhotep tends to appear in wide shots, in sequences of pure spectacle, in moments where the enormous scale of what he represents is more important than the specific texture of his face. The practical Imhotep appears in close-ups, in character scenes, in the moments where what is required is not supernatural spectacle, but human emotion. That separation, keeping the emotional weight with the practical performance and the spectacle with the digital, is a piece of sophisticated directorial thinking that is easy to overlook because it operates below the threshold of conscious attention. But it is the reason that Vosloo's performance survives the aging of the digital effects. It is the reason the emotional scenes involving Imhotep still work while certain of the action sequences involving him look unmistakably of their era. The film protected its emotional core from the technological limitations of its moment. That is not a small achievement. The fifth production fact is about the Magi, the warrior tribe that has been protecting the entrance to Hamunaptra for 3,000 years against exactly the kind of accidental resurrection that our protagonists proceed to enact in their first hour at the site. Oded Fehr's Ardat Bey is one of those supporting characters who has achieved a kind of independent cultural status. His face, his specific quality of watchful, word-weary authority, his line deliveries that carry the weight of a man who has spent his entire life guarding against a catastrophe he prays will never arrive and which has now arrived anyway, have remained distinctly memorable long after the details of the plot that surrounds him have blurred for many viewers. What is reportedly fascinating about RDF-based development is how much his role grew during production. The character was initially conceived as a more peripheral figure, a representative of the ancient protective tradition, present to explain mythology and provide assistance at specific plot moments, but not a genuine personality in his own right. What Fair brought to the role in auditions and then in production apparently shifted that calculation. The presence he created, the combination of physical authority and emotional restraint, the specific quality of a man who is simultaneously very old in his understanding and very young in his grief at what has come to pass, was compelling enough that scenes were expanded and developed around him. The Ardeth Bey who appears in the finished film is considerably more present and more dimensional than the character on the page apparently suggested he should be, and that dimensionality is entirely Fair's creation. Think about the scene where Ardeth Bey finds Rick and his company after the resurrection has already occurred, after the catastrophe has spent his life guarding against has been set in motion. What Fair does in that scene is resist every instinct toward dramatic accusation or theatrical despair. He is simply exhausted. He is a man who has run a race that his entire family and every family before his has been running for 3,000 years, and he has lost it, and the weight of that loss is not traumatic. It is practical, immediate, the specific tiredness of someone who now has to figure out how to address a catastrophe rather than prevent one. That quality, the shift from prevention to response, from vigilance to action, is something Fair communicates without being given explicit dialogue to carry it. He trusts the physical performance and the specific quality of stillness he brings to the character, and the scene is better for that trust. Now let us move into what the film actually achieves, not what it contains, but what it does with what it contains. Because the difference between those two things is precisely the difference between a film that is well constructed and a film that is genuinely good, and The Mummy deserves to be measured against the right standard. The performance architecture of this film is, I would argue, its single greatest achievement, and I use the word architecture deliberately. A good film performance in isolation can be impressive. What is rarer and more valuable is an ensemble where every performance is calibrated to every other performance, where the specific qualities each actor brings exist in productive relationship with the qualities everyone else brings, producing something in their combination that none of them could have produced individually. The Mummy has this, it has it to a degree that films with considerably more prestigious casts and considerably more critical recognition sometimes do not. Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz do not simply have chemistry in the conventional sense, in the sense of two attractive people who seem comfortable in each other's proximity. They have something more specific and more interesting than that. They have complementarity. Their energies are genuinely different. His is kinetic and forward-moving and slightly reckless. Hers is intelligent and curious and slightly overconfident in a different way, and those differences produce friction and then warmth and then something that reads as genuine partnership rather than merely romantic attachment. When Rick and Evie eventually come together, it does not feel like an inevitability delivered by the genre's expectations. It feels like a conclusion reached through genuine process. Two people who have discovered, through shared experience of extraordinary circumstances, that the person standing next to them in the middle of an ancient curse is exactly the person they would have chosen anyway. The specific scene that proved this most completely is not the romantic moments, though those work very well. It is a scene in the middle of the film where Rick and Evie disagree, genuinely disagree, with real stakes on both sides, about how to handle a situation that the adventure plot has placed in front of them. In that disagreement, the film briefly drops the entertainment register and simply watches two people think differently about the same problem and respect each other's thinking even while disagreeing with its conclusion. It is a scene that lasts perhaps 90 seconds. It is probably the truest scene in the film. And it works because Fraser and Weisz are genuinely listening to each other, genuinely building a specific interpersonal reality rather than hitting emotional marks, and the result is a moment of human texture that makes the romantic resolution of their story feel earned rather than assumed. John Hannah is doing something in this film that is technically extremely difficult and which tends to get dismissed as mere comic relief, which is both accurate and deeply unfair. The function of Jonathan Carnahan in the ensemble is to provide levity in moments of peak tension, to be the person who says the thing you cannot quite believe anyone would say in that situation, who prioritizes entirely the wrong things at entirely the wrong things at entirely the wrong moments, who operates on a frequency that is immune to the urgency of whatever is happening around him. That is a comedy function that requires perfect timing and absolute commitment, because if it lands incorrectly, it does not simply fail to be funny, it actively undermines the tension it is supposed to be releasing. Hannah never once undermines the tension. He always finds the exact register, the precise distance between broad comedy and genuine character that makes Jonathan feel like a real person responding to extraordinary events through the specific filter of his own personality rather than a comedy device interrupting the main story to deliver jokes. What Hannah achieves beyond the comedy, and this is worth naming specifically, is a version of bravery that the film does not acknowledge directly, but that I find quietly moving every time I see it. Jonathan is not brave in the conventional adventure hero sense. He is not physically fearless or strategically brilliant or willing to sacrifice himself for a cause, but there is a scene, and again I am staying just short of spoiler territory, where Jonathan is given a choice that he has no obligation to make in the direction of courage, and he makes it anyway. Not dramatically, not with a speech or declaration, simply because the person who needs him to make it is his sister, and she is scared, and he is there. In that moment, Jonathan Carnahan is not comic relief. He is a person doing something small and genuinely brave with no audience and no recognition and no expectation of either. And Hannah plays it so quietly that you might almost miss it. But if you are receiving the film rather than merely watching it, you do not miss it. And when you catch it, it changes your understanding of everything else he does. This screenplay, and I want to spend real time here because the writing in The Mummy is one of the most underappreciated elements of the film's construction, is significantly more intelligent than its reputation suggests. Summers's screenplay is doing something that only looks easy because it is executed so smoothly, which is the simultaneous maintenance of three entirely different storytelling registers. The adventure register requires momentum, case 6, physical spectacle, and the constant refreshing of tension through new complications. The romantic register requires emotional development, character specificity, genuine chemistry between the leads, and the patience to let a relationship build through behavior rather than declaration. The horror register requires dread, the genuine sense of supernatural threat, visual and atmospheric wrongness, and the audience's investment in the potential loss of characters they care about. Most films that attempt to work these registers simultaneously struggle to maintain both. The Mummy is attempting or three simultaneously, and maintaining all three for the majority of its running time. That is a screenwriting achievement, not a subtle one. The film is not hiding its intentions or operating through implication, but a genuine structural achievement that reflects a deep understanding of how these different storytelling modes work and what each of them requires to function. The dialogue deserves particular notice. In era when action-adventure screenplays tended toward either ponderous exposition or one-liner machines, when characters were often either explaining the plot or delivering quotable zingers with nothing in between, the dialogue in The Mummy has a quality of genuine conversation. The jokes are character-specific. The exposition is delivered by the person in the ensemble who would actually know the information being conveyed. The arguments are real arguments, two-sided, emotionally grounded, arising from specific character positions rather than plot convenience. And the film trusts its audience enough not to explain its own jokes, not to underline its emotional beats with music and close-up and reaction shot in the way that less confident filmmaking tends to do. The visual language of The Mummy is not, by the standards of prestige cinema, particularly complex. Summers is not a director who uses the camera to generate meaning through unconventional framing or compositional geometry in the way that a filmmaker like David Fincher or Alfonso Cuarón uses it. His visual instinct is classical. He frames for clarity, for the clean communication of spatial relationships, for the audience's ability to track action and character simultaneously without confusion. In the context of an adventure film, that classicism is a strength rather than a limitation. Clarity in action sequences is harder to achieve than it appears, and the ability to stage and photograph physical spectacle in a way that remains legible and exciting simultaneously is a genuine directorial skill that does not receive enough recognition because it is invisible when it works. But there are moments in The Mummy where the visual language does something more interesting than clarity, and those moments are worth examining closely because they reveal a directorial intelligence that is operating at a higher register than the film's general reputation suggests. The use of space in the Hamunaptra sequences, the way Summers frames the ruined architecture against the sky to emphasize scale and age, the way he uses shadows and torchlight in the underground chambers to create visual environments that feel simultaneously claustrophobic and vast, goes beyond functional storytelling. It creates a visual atmosphere that is genuinely expressive, that communicates something about the relationship between the ancient world and the small human figures moving through it that no amount of dialogue or exposition could convey with quite the same directness. There is a specific compositional choice that Summers makes consistently throughout the film that I find particularly intelligent, which is his tendency to place his characters in the lower third of the frame when they are in the desert or in Hamunaptra, to weight the composition heavily toward the sky or the ancient architecture above them. The effect is subtle but cumulative. Over the course of the film, you develop a visceral sense of the character's smallness relative to the world they are moving through. Not the smallness of weakness or insignificance, but the smallness of human beings in the presence of something genuinely ancient and genuinely vast. That spatial relationship between the human figures and the ancient world pressing down on them from above is not stated in the screenplay. It is built visually frame by frame in a way that operates on the viewer's sense of scale without their necessarily being conscious of how the effect is being achieved. The lighting choices deserve attention as well, particularly in the transition between the ancient world of the prologue and the contemporary adventure world of the main story. Ancient Egypt in Summers' visual vocabulary is cold, warm, rich amber-toned, beautiful in a way that feels simultaneously inviting and raw. The contemporary world, 1926, The Expedition, the adventure framework, is lit with a harder, whiter, more practical quality that speaks to the modern rather than the mythological. These two visual registers mirror the tonal registers of the story perfectly, and the moments where the ancient visual quality bleeds into the contemporary sequences, where the gold of Hamunaptra's underground chambers colors a scene that belongs narratively to the present, signal to the viewer, below the threshold of conscious attention, that the ancient world is reasserting itself, that the boundaries between past and present that the expedition has naively assumed were stable are beginning to dissolve. The cinematographer Adrian Biddle, working with practical lighting enhanced by the genuine desert sun, creates a visual texture in the exterior sequences that has a quality of authentic heat, not the simulated heat of a studio, but the genuine visual weight of real sunlight in a real desert, which produces a specific flatness and intensity in exterior photography that is very difficult to replicate in controlled conditions. Biddle was a cinematographer whose career included work on Thelma and Louise and the original Total Recall, and his instinct was always for a visual language that was expressive without being showy, that served the story rather than drawing attention to itself. In The Mummy, that instinct produces a cinematographic approach that feels exactly right for the material, confident, warm, occasionally beautiful, always in service of the world the film is building rather than in competition with it. The editing rhythm of The Mummy is another element that I think receives insufficient analysis because the editing is doing extraordinarily sophisticated work beneath the film's apparently straightforward surface. The film was edited by Bob Duxey, and the rhythm he creates, the pace at which scenes arrive and depart, the tempo within sequences of action and tension, the breathing space he allows between set pieces for character and relationship is one of the primary reasons the film's 2-hour running time feels comfortable rather than excessive. Consider the way the film handles its action sequences. Summers designs them with a structure that builds tension to escalation. Each beat in a sequence is more dangerous or more spectacular than the beat that preceded it, and Dux's editing honors that structure without falling into the trap of accelerating the pace beyond the audience's ability to process what is happening. The Sand Wars sequence, one of the film's most technically impressive and most visually distinctive set pieces, is a masterclass in this approach. The editing starts at a pace that allows you to understand the spatial geography of the scene, then accelerates gradually as the threat grows, then reaches a sustained fast cut tempo at the peak of the danger, then breathes out into held moment before the resolution. The entire sequence has a musical quality, not just because Goldsmith's score is present, but because the editing has its own rhythm that exists in productive relationship with the music rather than simply being synchronized to it. The comic timing in the editing is equally impressive and considerably less often discussed. The physical comedy sequences, Jonathan's ongoing relationship with physical catastrophe, Rick's responses to situations that would reduce most people to paralysis, the ensemble chaos that the film periodically allows itself when the plot requires a beat of pure levity, are edited with a precision that reflects a genuine understanding of how comedy works mechanically. Comedy, as any editor will tell you, is largely a question of duration, of allowing a beat exactly as much time as it needs to land and no more, of resisting both the early cut that denies the joke its punchline and the held shot that explains the joke after it has already arrived. Dux's comedy editing in The Mummy is consistently unfailingly precise. The jokes land, not because they are the funniest jokes ever written, but because they are given exactly the right amount of space and time to become as funny as they were designed to be. Sound design is often the most invisible element of a successful film, and in The Mummy, it operates with a sophistication that I suspect most viewers have never consciously registered, because it is so completely integrated into the experience of watching. The ancient world has a specific sonic signature, a particular quality of resonance and low frequency presence that speaks of stone and sand and the specific silence of very deep, very old enclosed spaces. The contemporary adventure world has a different sonic texture, brighter, more immediate, the sounds of horses and guns and explosions and the general kinetic noise of humans in motion. And the moment where those two sonic worlds begin to bleed into each other, where the deep resonance of the ancient starts to underlie the contemporary soundtrack, is handled with such precision that you feel the incursion of the past into the present before you consciously identify what has changed in what you are hearing. The use of silence in The Mummy is particularly effective in the Hamunaptra sequences. The ancient city, when the expedition first arrives, is not accompanied by silence in the absolute sense. There is wind, there is the sound of sand, there are the incidental sounds of the physical environment, but there is a quality of deep quiet beneath those surface sounds, a sense of held breath that the film creates through careful manipulation of the sound design. When that quality of deep quiet is suddenly filled, when sound rushes in with the first signs of supernatural activity, the contrast is genuinely startling. Not because the sound is particularly loud, but because the silence that preceded it was so complete that any intrusion into it feels like a violation. Jerry Goldsmith's score deserves a separate and more extended analysis than film criticism has typically given it, because it is doing genuinely complex creative work in multiple registers simultaneously. They differentiate the most immediately recognizable element, the brass-led main theme, the driving action music, the warm romantic material that accompanies Rick and Evie's developing relationship, and they are superb in the way that all of Goldsmith's best work is superb, melodically clear, emotionally direct, technically immaculate, but the ancient material is where the score operates at its most sophisticated, and where Goldsmith's specific genius is most visible. The musical language Goldsmith developed for the ancient Egypt sequences draws on a set of modal and harmonic choices that are associated with non-Western musical traditions without being imitative of any specific tradition, a form of musical suggestion that creates the feeling of ancientness without making the specific claim of authenticity. It is music that sounds like it could have existed 3,000 years ago, while clearly being a contemporary composition, and that temporal ambiguity is exactly what the film needs. It creates the same boundary blurring between past and present that the visual language is creating simultaneously, the same sense that the wall separating the ancient world from the modern one is thinner than we assumed. The score's most emotionally powerful deployment is in the sequences involving Imhotep's grief, the moments where the film acknowledges, however briefly, the tragedy at the center of its monster. Goldsmith gave Imhotep's love story a musical theme that is genuinely tender, not menacing, not supernatural, not connected to the horror register at all. It is a simple, unadorned melodic line that carries a quality of longing that is almost unbearable when you hear it played against images of the creature's terrible power. The contrast between the simplicity and thinness of that theme and the horror of what surrounds it creates an emotional complexity that the screenplay alone could not quite achieve, a musical argument for Imhotep's humanity in the middle of his monstrousness, a reminder that the thing doing terrible damage to the world is also the thing that loves someone more than anything in the world and has been paying for that love for 3,000 years. The romantic theme associated with Rick and Evie is, by contrast, more buoyant and more contemporary, a warmer, more grounded melodic idea that feels rooted in the present rather than the ancient past. And Goldsmith does something very subtle with the relationship between these two themes across the film's running time, gradually allowing them to share harmonic space, to occupy the same musical moment in ways that suggest structurally, before the narrative makes it explicit, that the pleasant love story and the ancient one are in some profound relationship with each other. Not a mystical reincarnation relationship in the way that the film's mythology might suggest, but an emotional relationship, two versions of the same fundamental human experience, separated by 3,000 years and by the question of whether love has to accept loss or whether it can fight it. What this film achieves, at the level of its craft, is the creation of a genuinely coherent and genuinely pleasurable total experience out of elements that should not work together as well as they do. Adventure and horror and romantic comedy and genuine tragedy are not natural bedfellows. They require different things from the storytelling around them. They pull in different directions tonally and structurally, and the history of genre cinema is littered with films that attempted this combination and fell apart in the middle because the competing demands became irreconcilable. The Mummy, codes. It codes because every element of its craft, the performances, the screenplay, the direction, the cinematography, the editing, the sound design, the score, is pulling in the same direction toward the same experience with the same understanding of what the film is ultimately trying to give you. That understanding is this: the mummy is not trying to be profound. It is not trying to permanently alter your understanding of human experience or cinema or the relationship between them. It is trying to give you the specific experience of genuine adventure, of a world large enough to contain wonders, of danger that is real but survivable, of love that develops between two people who are exactly right for each other in ways that neither of them initially perceives, of an ancient evil that is genuinely threatening but also genuinely human, of 2 hours in which the world outside the screen is less real than the world inside it. That is not a small ambition. That is, in fact, an enormous ambition, because genuine entertainment that works on you without your permission, that gives you what you needed without your asking for it, is one of the hardest things that cinema attempts. And on its own terms, within its own ambitions, The Mummy achieves it with a consistency and a warmth and a genuine craft that deserves considerably more acknowledgement than it typically receives. And yet, and yet, because honest criticism is not the enemy of genuine affection, it is in fact the deepest form of it. To love something truly is to see it completely, to acknowledge what it reaches for and falls short of alongside what it reaches for and finds. And The Mummy, for all the warmth I carry toward it, for all the genuine craft I have just spent considerable time tracing through its bones, is not a perfect film. It is not even close to a perfect film. And the places where it falls short are not incidental surface blemishes, the kind of minor imperfections that any ambitious production accumulates without their mattering very much. Some of them are genuine wounds. Some of them represent missed opportunities so significant that acknowledging them requires sitting with a mild, specific grief, the grief of seeing what a film could have been alongside what it actually is. The most serious flaw in The Mummy is one that the film shares with most adventure cinema of its era, but that does not make it less serious or less worthy of honest examination. It is the film's relationship with the ancient Egyptian world it draws upon so extensively and so enthusiastically as the source of its mythology, its atmosphere, its emotional architecture, and with the contemporary Egyptian and Arab characters who inhabit the world around its Western protagonists. Put plainly, The Mummy is a film that is deeply, genuinely in love with ancient Egypt as a cultural and imaginative resource, and almost completely uninterested in Egypt as a living civilization populated by real people with real stakes in their own history and their own heritage. Think about what that means concretely. The film's Egyptian characters fall into two primary categories. There are the ancient Egyptians, Imhotep, Anck-su-namun, the pharaoh, the priests who are given genuine interiority, genuine emotional complexity, genuine tragic weight. They are the source of the film's mythological power. And there are the contemporary Egyptians, the prison warden, the various market traders and crowd members, the soldiers, the servants, who exist largely as comic background, as obstacles, as the generic foreign scenery through which the Western protagonists move on their way to the ancient story. The Magi, who are the most dimensionally realized of the film's non-Western contemporary characters, are nonetheless primarily defined by their function in relation to the Western storyline. They exist to protect against a threat, to provide exposition about the mythology, to be impressive and mysterious and helpful at key moments. Ardus Bey is a wonderful character, and Fair's performance is genuinely excellent. But the Magi as a group are a fantasy, a romanticized warrior tribe whose purpose is to serve the adventure narrative rather than to represent any genuine historical or cultural reality. This is a flaw that runs deep into the film's structural assumptions. It inherits from the adventure fiction tradition that Summers was deliberately invoking, the tradition of Rider Haggard and Edgar Rice Burroughs and the early adventure serials, a framework that treats non-Western cultures as landscapes rather than as civilizations, as the setting for Western character stories rather than as the subjects of their own. The Mummy does this without malice and almost certainly without conscious intention. but the effect is real regardless of the intention, and the film would be both a better film and a more honest one if it had found ways to complicate that framework rather than simply inheriting it. The counter argument, and it deserves to be made honestly, is that The Mummy is operating in a specific genre tradition that carries specific conventions, and that the audience for the film in 1999 was not primarily seeking a nuanced interrogation of colonial adventure fiction's relationship with the cultures it romanticizes. The counter argument is that the film's warmth and generosity of spirit extend, in their own limited way, to its non-Western characters, that Ardat Bey is a figure of genuine dignity and authority, that the film never positions the Western protagonist as simply superior to the world they move through, that the mythology it draws on is treated with visual and atmospheric reverence, even when the characters who carry that mythology are not given full interiority. These are real points. They do not eliminate the flaw, but they do contextualize it within the film's specific ambitions and limitations. And honest criticism requires both the identification of the flaw and the acknowledgement of the context that shaped it. The second significant flaw is one of tonal commitment, or more precisely, the film's occasional unwillingness to commit fully to the implications of its own emotional stakes. There are moments in The Mummy where the story arrives at a genuinely dark place, where what is happening to the characters, or what they are being asked to feel, or what the mythology they have unleashed is actually doing to the world around them. And the film retreats. It retreats not into incompetence, but into comfort, into the familiar safety of the adventure register, into a joke or an action beat that releases the tension before it has fully accumulated. And in those moments, something is lost. Not something large, not something that fundamentally breaks the film's experience, but something real. The sense of genuine stakes, of real risk, of a story that is willing to follow its own darkness wherever it leads. The plague sequences are the clearest example of this. The biblical plagues that Imhotep releases upon Egypt are, in the mythological tradition from which the film draws, acts of almost incomprehensible collective suffering, events that affect an entire civilization, that leave permanent marks on the landscape and the culture and the memory of the people who endure them. In The Mummy, the plagues arrive with considerable visual spectacle and then are processed almost immediately by the ensemble's comedy register, by Rick's quips, by Jonathan's priorities, by the film's general insistence on maintaining its adventure surface even when the horror beneath it is, if you let yourself think about it, genuinely catastrophic in scale. The film never quite reckons with what these plagues would mean for the actual people of Cairo. It keeps its camera on the protagonists and their responses rather than on the wider consequences, and in doing so, it protects its tonal comfort at the cost of a genuine engagement with what it has invoked. This is not a flaw unique to The Mummy. It is, in fact, one of the defining structural choices of the adventure genre from Indiana Jones onward, the decision to keep the emotional and moral weight of the story focused on a small group of protagonists, while the wild historical stakes remain largely abstract. Raiders of the Lost Art Mills faces at the end, and we do not particularly grieve for them because we have been trained by the film to care only about the small group at the center. The Mummy operates by the same logic. But knowing that the logic is genre standard does not make the costs of it invisible. The plagues could have meant something more than they do. The scale of what Imhotep is doing to the world could have registered as something more than a spectacular backdrop to the central adventure. And the film's choice not to press on those implications is a genuine missed opportunity, even if it is an entirely understandable one. The third flaw is more technical but not less real, and it concerns the pacing of the second act specifically. The Mummy's first act, the establishment of the world, the characters, the mythology, the stakes, is beautifully paced. Third act, the convergence of all threads toward the climax, is energetic and satisfying. But there is a stretch in the middle of the film, roughly between the initial arrival at Hamunaptra and the full awakening of Imhotep's power, where the narrative loses some of its forward momentum. The film introduces complications without fully developing them, moves between character moments and action sequences without always finding the right rhythm, and occasionally substitutes spectacle for the emotional development that the story actually needs at that point. This pacing problem is, I suspect, partially a consequence of the film's tonal ambitions. Maintaining three genre registers simultaneously requires a kind of constant attention and adjustment, and the middle act is where the demands of those three registers come into their most direct competition. The adventure register wants escalating action, the romantic register wants the space for emotional development, the horror register wants the accumulation of dread, the slow tightening of supernatural threat. Satisfying all three simultaneously in the middle act without giving any of them the sustained attention it needs produces a sequence of scenes that individually work but collectively feel slightly fragmented, like a piece of music played at the right notes but not quite at the right tempo. The character of Benny Rick's former Legion Conrad, played with considerable commitment by Kevin J. O'Connor, represents another missed opportunity that I find myself returning to. Benny has all the ingredients of a genuinely interesting supporting character. He is the dark mirror of Rick, someone who shared the same formative experiences, who made different choices in response to those experiences, who chose survival through betrayal while Rick chose survival through loyalty. That contrast should carry real weight. It should illuminate something about who Rick is by showing who he could have been. And there are moments in O'Connor's performance where that weight is briefly visible, where Benny's specific combination of resourcefulness and self-preservation reads as something almost sympathetic, a man who learned the wrong lessons from the right circumstances. But the film does not develop that contrast with any sustained intention. Benny remains primarily a comic villain, useful for plot mechanics, occasionally funny in his transparent cowardice, but never given the scene or the moment that would elevate him from narrative function to genuine character. The relationship between Rick and Benny, which should be one of the film's most emotionally complex threads, the friendship corroded by survival into mutual contempt, is sketched rather than developed, implied rather than explored. And because it is sketched rather than developed, Benny's eventual fate does not carry the weight it should. It lands as plot resolution rather than as human consequence. The film does not quite feel what it should feel about that moment, because it has not done the prior work of making you feel what you should feel about the relationship it resolves. The romantic subplot between Jonathan and the film's incidental female characters is essentially non-existent, which is a minor complaint but worth noting because Jonathan's character has qualities: the specific combination of charm and transparent inadequacy, the warmth beneath the buffoonery that could have supported a romantic dimension without displacing the central relationship. It is not a significant flaw, but it represents a small unexplored space in a film that is otherwise quite economical about its character real estate. The film's villain structure also presents a limitation that becomes more apparent on repeated viewings. Imhotep is an extraordinarily compelling antagonist on the terms the film establishes for him, but the film gives him no genuine counterpart, no antagonist within the antagonist framework who complicates or enriches the central threat. The American treasure hunters, who appear in the first and second acts as a parallel expedition, serve this structural function partially, but they are resolved too quickly and too easily to have accumulated the kind of dramatic weight that a true secondary antagonist requires. By the time the film reaches its climax, the threat is entirely Imhotep and the response is entirely Rick and Evie and Jonathan, and while that clarity is satisfying in an adventure framework, it slightly narrows the emotional range of the final confrontation. A more dimensional secondary threat or a more extended development of the Benny relationship as a form of secondary antagonism would have given the climax more layers to resolve and more emotional textures to work with. These flaws are real, they are worth naming. They represent genuine limitations in a film that has very real and very considerable strengths, and the experience of The Mummy is enriched, not diminished, by holding them alongside the things the film does beautifully. Because that is what honest engagement with cinema demands. Not the elevation of beloved films into objects of uncritical celebration, but the full spectrum view that sees everything a film is doing and evaluates it with the same warmth and rigor that we would want applied to our own work. What makes these flaws ultimately minor wounds rather than fatal ones is something that is very difficult to define precisely but very easy to feel, which is that the film's emotional core is intact and functioning despite all of them. You can identify every tonal retreat, every underdeveloped character, every missed opportunity for genuine darkness, and still find at the end of the film that it has given you something real. Still find that you have felt something true. Still find that 2 hours in its company has left you warmer than when you arrived. That resilience, the ability of a film's genuine heart to keep beating even through its surface imperfections, is not universal. Many films with better craft and fewer structural flaws do not possess it. The Mummy does. And that is worth understanding as clearly as the flaws themselves. So, what is the Mummy actually saying? Not what it describes, not what happens in it, not what genre it belongs to, but what does it understand about human experience that it is trying to share with you through the specific form of this story. Here is the thing about this film that I keep returning to. The idea that lives at its genuine center beneath all the sand and spectacle and scarabs. The Mummy is a film about the relationship between the past and the present, not in the abstract philosophical sense, not as a meditation on history or memory or the way that civilizations build on the ruins of what came before, but in the most immediate, most personal, most emotionally available sense. It is a film about what happens when the past will not stay past, when grief refuses to become history, when love, or what passes for love at its most consuming and most dangerous, refuses to accept none that time tries to offer it. Imhotep is not simply a supernatural threat. He is the embodied form of a refusal. The refuse to let go, the refusal to accept that loss is irreversible, that the dead stay dead, that the only healthy relationship with grief is the one that eventually allows it to transform into something that can coexist with the living. Is 3,000 years of accumulated inability to move forward, compressed into a physical form and unleashed on a world that has already moved on without him, that has built its entire present on foundations that his unresolved grief is now threatening to destroy. Think about what that means. Every play he releases, every act of consumption and reconstitution, every step toward the goal of his resurrection project, all of it is, at its most fundamental, a refusal to grieve properly. A catastrophic word threatening refusal to do the thing that every living person is eventually asked to do, which is to hold your loss inside you and keep living anyway. And here is the counterpoint that the film constructs against Imhotep's refusal. Is Evelyn Canahan. Evie is a woman who has oriented her entire life around the past. Her profession, her passion, her intellectual framework, all of it is rooted in the ancient world, in the civilization that Imhotep comes from, in the language and the symbols and the knowledge systems of a people who have been dead for thousands of years. She lives in the past in the most complete and committed way that a living person can live in the past. And yet she is, and this is the film's central contrast, operating so quietly that it is easy to miss entirely. She is fully alive in the present. She is curious and warm and present and capable of love in the way that people who have chosen life over its alternatives are capable of love. She is someone who has found a way to be profoundly devoted to the past without being imprisoned by it, without letting her relationship with what has been destroy her capacity for what is and what will be. The film is, at its deepest, a story about those two ways of relating to loss and the past. Imhotep's way, total, consuming, refusing, catastrophic in its insistence on recovering what cannot be recovered. And Evie's way, reverential, devoted, intellectually and emotionally alive to what the past contains, but ultimately choosing the present, choosing the living, choosing Rick, who is the most thoroughly present tense person in the film, a man who does not appear to possess a past that he carries with any particular weight, who exists entirely in the moment he is currently occupying and deals with what that moment presents. That contrast between the past imprisoned and the past honoring, between the refusal to grieve and the ability to carry grief without being destroyed by it, is what gives The Mummy its emotional resonance beyond the adventure surface. It is why the film feels like more than entertainment to the people who love it most deeply. It is touching something real about human experience, about the specific challenge of holding loss without letting loss become the only thing you hold, about the specific courage required to choose the living when everything in you wants to remain with the dead. The motif of the Book of the Dead and the Book of Amun-Ra, the two ancient texts that function as the film's central symbolic objects, operates within this thematic framework with a precision that the film never makes explicit, but that is absolutely present in the structure. The Book of the Dead is the instrument of resurrection. It is the text that brings back what was gone, that refuses the finality of death, that insists on the recovery of what has been lost. It is Imhotep's instrument, the embodiment of his refusal. The Book of Amun-Ra is the instrument of resolution. It is the text that restores the natural order, that accepts the finality that the Book of the Dead denied, that allows the present to reassert itself against the past refusal to release its claim. In the hands of someone who lives in the past without being imprisoned by it, in Evie's hands, it becomes the instrument that finally, irrevocably, closes the wound that 3,000 years of unresolved grief have kept open. The recurring image of sand in The Mummy is worth dwelling on in this context because it operates as a visual motif throughout the film with a consistency that feels intentional whether or not it was entirely planned. Sand is the medium through which the ancient world is approached and entered. It is the substance that covered Hamunaptra and preserved Imhotep and kept the past sealed against the present. When the sand moves, when it swerves and builds and ultimately becomes the instrument of the film's most spectacular sequence, it is the past becoming physically active in the present, the ancient world asserting its presence through the most fundamental element of the landscape that has always covered it. And when the sand finally settles at the end, when the great swirling wall collapses and the desert returns to stillness, it is the past finally returning to where it belongs, back beneath the surface of a present that can now continue without it dressing upward through the ground. The eyes in The Mummy are another recurring motif that carries genuine symbolic weight. Eyes are everywhere in ancient Egyptian iconography: the eye of Horus, the eyes of the gods on sarcophagi and tomb walls, the eyes of the statues that watch over sacred spaces. And Summers uses the imagery of eyes throughout the film with a consistency that goes beyond art direction. Imhotep's eyes is restored human eyes, which gradually reconstitute as he fades and grows stronger, function as the measure of his resurrection's progress. The eyes painted on the outside of his sarcophagus watch from the wall as Evie opens the book that will set him free. The eyes of the statues in Hamunaptra's underground chambers seem to track the expedition's progress through spaces they were never meant to enter. Eyes throughout the film represent the ancient world's awareness of the present, the past's gaze falling on those who have presumed to disturb. And within the human story, the exchange of gazes between Rick and Evie functions as the film's most subtle romantic language. Their relationship develops not primarily through dialogue or gesture, but through the specific quality of how they look at each other, how that quality changes from guarded assessment to curious interest to the specific, slightly startled recognition that the person you have been looking at has become, without your quite deciding it, the person you want to keep looking at. The film trusts this visual language implicitly. It does not underline it or explain it. It simply places two people in each other's sightlines repeatedly and allows the accumulation of those moments to do the work of building a relationship that the screenplay's dialogue only occasionally touches on directly. What this film understands about love, and here is where I think it genuinely earns its place in the conversation beyond pure entertainment, is that love in its healthiest form is not the refusal of loss that Imhotep embodies. It is the acceptance of vulnerability in the presence of potential loss. Pico Connor, who has spent his entire life moving fast enough that attachment cannot quite catch him, is not transformed by love into someone who is no longer in danger. He is transformed into someone who chooses to be in danger because the person standing next to him is worth being in danger for. That is a subtle but significant distinction. He does not become less himself. He does not abandon the quality of present tense freedom that defines him. He simply finds for the first time a reason to be present in a specific present, this one, with this person, rather than perpetually in motion toward the next one. And Evie, who loves the past with her whole professional and intellectual self, discovers through Rick that the present contains things worth loving with the same wholeness. That the living world, for all its comparative brevity and fragility relative to the ancient one, contains the specific, irreplaceable quality of what is actually here, actually now, actually available to be loved in return. The ancient world is magnificent and vast and endlessly worthy of devotion. But it cannot love you back, and that limitation, the specific limitation of the past's inability to reciprocate, is something the film understands quietly and does not state directly but builds into the structure of every scene between Evie and Rick with a consistency that reads on accumulated viewing as genuine wisdom. What does the mummy understand about adventure? About the specific human need for the experience of adventure, the need that has driven storytelling in this mode from Homer onward. It understands that adventure is not primarily about the treasure or the monster or the ancient curse. It is about that discovery of yourself in conditions that the ordinary world never provides, conditions of genuine urgency, genuine danger, genuine consequence, genuine need. You cannot know what you are capable of in safety. Safety reveals the surface of you. Adventure reaches deeper, finds the capacities and qualities and commitments that daily life never activates, and brings them to the surface where they can be seen and known and, in the best cases, kept. Rick does not discover who he is in the desert. He confirms who he has always been in circumstances that make that confirmation impossible to ignore. And Evie does not discover who she is in Hamunaptra. She discovers that who she has always been is sufficient, that her specific combination of intellectual passion and human warmth and genuine courage, which the world she normally inhabits tends to undervalue, is exactly what this extraordinary situation requires. The scarab beetles that appear throughout the film, the swarming, tunneling, deeply disturbing image of flesh consumed from within, are one of the film's most effective horror images and simultaneously one of its most interesting thematic symbols. The scarab in ancient Egyptian symbolism was associated with resurrection, with the cycle of death and rebirth, with the sun's daily journey through the underworld and its return to the light. In the mummy, the sacred image of rebirth has become a little instrument of consumption. The sacred beetle turned into a devouring swarm, the symbol of renewal become the agent of destruction. That inversion speaks directly to the film's central thematic concern. Imhotep's entire project is an inversion of the natural order, a refusal of the death that gives rebirth its meaning, an insistence on resurrection that has no regard for what that resurrection costs the living world. The Beatles embody that inversion perfectly. Their resurrection symbol turned against life itself. The sacred become the terrible through the specific alchemy of a grief that has outgrown its containment. The film's real-world resonance, the specific way it speaks to experiences that exist outside its mythological framework, lives in its understanding of what obsession does to those who carry it and to those around them. Imhotep's obsession is supernatural in its scale and its consequences, but the underlying psychology is entirely human and entirely recognizable. The inability to accept that what you loved is gone, the willingness to cause suffering to the world around you in the service of a recovery project that the world recognizes as impossible, the specific blindness of grief that has girded into obsession, the way it narrows the obsessed person's perception until the only thing they can see is the lost thing, until the only frame through which they can process experience is whether each new moment brings them closer to or farther from the recovery they have decided is necessary. The world pays the cost of Imhotep's inability to grieve and move forward. The world always pays the cost of that particular inability when it manifests in a person with sufficient power to externalize their internal state. That is a genuinely human truth, dressed in extraordinary supernatural clothing. And cinema at its best is one of the most effective vehicles we have for delivering genuinely human truths through extraordinary clothing, for taking the architecture of human experience and building it large enough that we can see it clearly, as we cannot always see it in our own lives, where it is scaled to ordinary human size and therefore blends with the background. The Mummy does this, not with the sophistication of the films we typically cite when we make this kind of argument, not with the visual and narrative complexity of the greatest cinema, but with genuine feeling and genuine understanding in a form that reaches people who might not be reached by more formally ambitious attempts to communicate the same truths. Now, The Mummy does not exist in isolation. It was the beginning of something, the foundation of a franchise that Universal hoped would restore the monster universe to cultural relevance, and the beginning of a series of films that followed the specific characters established here into further adventures and further mythological territory. The question of where the Mummy stands in relation to what it began is worth engaging with directly and honestly. The 1999 film was followed by The Mummy Returns in 2001, and then by a further expansion of the franchise that included the Scorpion King spin-off series, The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor in 2008, and ultimately the deeply troubled 2017 reboot that attempted to launch a broader Universal Monsters shared universe under the Dark Universe banner. The 2017 reboot, starring Tom Cruise and directed by Alex Kurtzman, was by critical and commercial consensus a significant failure, and its failure effectively ended the Dark Universe project before it properly began. The contrast between the 1999 film's success and the 2017 film's failure is in itself an instructive study in what makes adventure cinema work and what makes it collapse. But the immediate franchise question, the question of how the 1999 film relates to The Mummy Returns, is the more interesting one for our purposes. The Mummy Returns arrived in 2001 with a larger budget, a more ambitious scale, the return of the principal cast, and the addition of Dwayne Johnson in what was, at the time, his first significant film role. It was a considerable commercial success, substantially outperforming even the original's box office. And it was, critically ending the longer assessment of the franchise's most devoted viewers, a film that understood its predecessor's strengths intellectually without fully capturing them intuitively. Here is the thing about The Mummy Returns that is worth saying clearly. It is more action, more spectacle, more locations, more characters, more mythology, more digital effects, more plot, and in that abundance it loses something that the original had, a quality of genuine discovery, of encountering characters and a world for the first time, of the specific excitement that comes from not yet knowing whether what you have found is going to be extraordinary or ordinary. Sequels cannot replicate the experience of originals. That is not a flaw unique to the Mummy franchise, it is the fundamental structural challenge of all serialized storytelling. But it is particularly acute here because so much of what makes the 1999 film work is its atmosphere of surprise, its quality of arrival, its sense of a world opening rather than continuing. What the 1999 Mummy adds to the larger conversation of its franchise is the thing that everything which follows it is attempting to recapture without ever quite managing it. A specific tonal balance, a specific quality of genuine warmth between its characters, a specific relationship between horror and comedy and romance and adventure that exists in the original in a precise equilibrium that the sequels and the reboot both disrupted in different ways and for different reasons. The Mummy Returns disrupts it through excess, through the addition of so much additional material that the equilibrium is overwhelmed. The 2008 Tomb of the Dragon Emperor disrupts it through the casting change at the film's romantic center, which fundamentally alters the chemistry that the original's equilibrium depended on. And the 2017 reboot disrupts it by attempting to replace the balance entirely with a darker, more serious, more conventionally horror-oriented framework that abandoned the adventure comedy heart of the original in favor of something that neither the cast nor the production could make compelling. What the 1999 film establishes for the franchise and what the franchise was never able to fully build on is a model of adventure filmmaking in which character warmth is the load-bearing structural element. Every set piece works better because you care about the people in it. Every moment of horror lands harder because you care whether these specific people survive it. Every comedy beat is funnier because you care about these specific people enough to find their responses to impossible situations genuinely revealing. Remove the character warmth, or dilute it, or replace it, or overwhelm it with scale and spectacle, and what remains is technically competent adventure filmmaking that produces none of the specific emotional effects that make the original so durably lovable. The 1999 film stands in its franchise in the position that the first Indiana Jones film stands in that franchise, as the original statement of a specific vision, imperfect but irreplaceable, against which everything that follows is inevitably measured and by which everything that follows is inevitably found wanting in some way. Not because sequels are inherently inferior, but because the original moment of discovery, the first time you encounter a world and find it wonderful, is an experience that time and familiarity cannot restore. You can return to Hamunaptra many times, but you can only arrive there once. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The ending of The Mummy is where everything the film has been building, every thematic thread about grief and love and the past's refusal to release its claim on the present, finally resolves into a single, quietly devastating moment. Imhotep, fully resurrected and fully powerful, is stripped of his immortality by Evie reading from the Book of Amun-Ra. And in that moment of stripping, in the moment where 3,000 years of supernatural preservation are suddenly withdrawn, what Vosloo communicates is not rage or despair, but something almost like relief. As though the ending of the impossible project is, in some part of him that the obsession never fully consumed, a mercy. He asks in his ancient tongue why she could not have been the one, why the woman standing before him, who carries something of Anck-su-namun's soul, chose the living man over the undead one. And then he is gone, pulled into the underworld, returned to the death he spent 3,000 years refusing. That moment earns every thematic argument the film has been making. The past finally returns to the past. And what remains, standing in the ruins of Hamunaptra as the city collapses into the sand, are two living people who chose each other, who chose the present, who chose the irreplaceable and terrifying and wonderful experience of being alive and in love in a world that does not come with guarantees. The city sinks. The sand reclaims everything. Enrique and Evie ride away on camels into a desert sunset, with Jonathan trailing behind them, complaining about the loss of the treasure. And it is funny and warm and completely earned, and it leaves you feeling precisely the thing that the best adventure cinema leaves you feeling, that the world is large and strange and full of wonders, and that the best way to meet it is with someone you trust beside you. The moment I have never been able to leave behind. The single image from this film that lives most permanently in me is not the spectacle. It is the look on Rachel Weisz's face in the instant before Evie reads from the Book of Amun-Ra. She is terrified. She is absolutely certain of what she is about to do and absolutely uncertain whether it will work. And she does it anyway. That specific courage of someone who is afraid and acts despite the fear rather than in its absence is the truest thing in the film. And it lands so completely because Weisz has spent 2 hours making you believe in this person entirely. Did The Mummy change how I see something? Yes. It reminded me, and this is a thing that needs reminding, more often than you might expect, that sincerity is a form of courage. That making something warm and generous and genuinely entertaining, without apology and without irony, requires a commitment that is just as real as the commitment required to make something dark and serious and formally ambitious. The Mummy chose warmth, consistently, deliberately, at the cost of some of the darkness it could have had. And the world it left behind, the specific 2 hour warmth of it, the comfort of its adventure, and the genuineness of its heart, is not a lesser gift than what a more ambitious film might have offered. It is simply a different one, and for the many millions of people who have returned to it across more than 2 decades, it has clearly been exactly the gift they needed. I give The Mummy a 6.8 out of 10. And here is the one true sentence that earns that number. It is a film that knows exactly what it is, gives you everything it promises, and leaves the specific warmth in the chest that outlasts any argument you might make against it, which is, finally, the only thing that matters about a film you love. Some films you admire, some you respect, some you return to because they challenge you or disturb you or change how you see the world. And some, the rarest kind, you return to simply because being inside them feels like being home. The Mummy is that kind of film. Imperfect, warm, genuinely crafted, and utterly irreplaceable. The sand always settles. But this one stays. If this essay gave you something, a like, a comment, a subscription means more than you know. Tell me, does the Mummy hold up for you, or has time changed how you feel about it? And what film made you feel like adventure was still possible? Next time we go somewhere completely different. Stay curious. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.